Welcome. It's so nice to see you all today. We're just going to give it a minute for people to join us. So just settle in. Great. It's so good to see so many of you. I am delighted to welcome you to our virtual panel today, the Rosa and Perry Memorial Lecture, Giuseppe Penone and Interconnection with Nature. As we begin, allow me to say the museum recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples, a long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the Walking Purchase of 1737, displaced many Lenape from this land. The museum and its staff, including myself, strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to Lenape people and their vibrant communities today. And that includes the federally recognized nations, the Delaware Tribe, Delaware Nation, and Stockbridge-Munsee community. So my name is Linnea West, and I have the honor of welcoming you to today's program, the Rosa and Perry Memorial Lecture, Giuseppe Penone and Interconnection with Nature. I'll begin by thanking the Perry family, whose support enables this annual lecture. So today's panel brings together a variety of thoughtful and perhaps provocative perspectives on the relationship between the human and natural worlds, a relationship that the artist Giuseppe Penone has considered throughout his career. Currently at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, there's an exhibition of his drawings entitled River of Forms, Giuseppe Penone's Drawings, curated by Carlos Basualdo. It's on view through February 26th, and I encourage you to see it if you have not already. So Penone's relationship to nature inspires today's panel, which reconsiders the supposed strict dichotomy between the human and natural worlds. And to explore some of these ideas, we are joined by a really incredible group of speakers. I will share a little bit of their bios with you, a teaser. We'll put longer versions of their bios in the chat in case you want to learn more. So to begin, our moderator today is Dr. Lara Demori. Lara, thank you for being with us.
Hi, thank you, Linnea, for inviting me.
So Lara is going to begin with a presentation that roots us in Penone's practice, and she is very well poised to do this, as Lara was the Marcello Ruma Fellow in Contemporary Italian Art, and then Research Associate here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And in those roles, she helped organize our current exhibition of Penone's drawings. Currently, Lara is a postdoctoral fellow at the Biblioteca Hertziana, Max Planck Institute for Art History in Rome. So following that, we will hear from Scott Gilbert. Hello, Scott.
Hello, pleased to be here.
Scott is the Howard A. Schneiderman Professor of Biology Emeritus at Swarthmore College, where he's taught embryology and the history and critiques of biology. Scott's biological research looks at how changes in embryonic development can generate evolutionary novelties, focusing on changes in gene expressions can create the shell of a turtle and how symbiotic microbes generate the rumen of cattle. Our next presentation will be from Joan Kane. Joan, hello.
Good afternoon.
It's great to have you here. Joan is a poet. She's the visiting assistant professor and visiting poet at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Inupiaq with family from Ujjiavak and Koyarak, she has written 8 books of poetry and prose, supported by fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Harvard's Radcliffe Institute, Brown Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, among others. And our final presentation will be from Sarah Gilbert. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sarah is an artist and an educator based in Los Angeles. In work exploring craft and collectivity, she often moves between art and science, synthesizing traditional craft techniques with emerging technologies. She's currently assistant professor of sculpture and affiliate faculty in gender and feminist studies at Pitzer College. So you can already glean from that we have a variety of perspectives to bring to this broad topic. I'll just go over a few bits of housekeeping. We are saving time at the end for Q&A. You can put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. there's an upvote feature in the Q&A box. So if you see a question you like, you can give it a thumbs up. It'll go to the top of the queue, and those are the ones we'll answer first. We are using the chat. We'll share links and more information with you that way. The program is closed captioned, so you can turn the closed captioning on or off by clicking the CC button in the Zoom toolbar. Finally, we are recording today's program. We're going to send a follow-up email tomorrow. It'll include a link to the recording, any other links we share in the chat, so you can look back at that. So up next, each of our speakers are going to present briefly. We'll have a moderated discussion, and as I said, we are saving time for Q&A. We expect the program to last a bit over an hour. Laura, with that, I'm happy to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Linnea, and thank you everyone for being here, especially our speakers and all the people that are tuning in. And thanks so much, Steve Keever, that is our technician, for playing our PowerPoints too. So while I talk, we see a few installation shots of the show and also the drawings, so which hopefully will help you to get an idea of Penone's work if you're not familiar with him, and also how the show is articulated. But of course, I really suggest you to come to the museum in person to see these works. So I'm going to just introduce Giuseppe Penone briefly, and then just a few key ideas that we wanted to develop in the show. Giuseppe Penone was born in 1947 and grew up in Garesio, a village in the countryside in the northern Italian region of Piedmont. His rural upbringing influences practice, which interrogates and explores the connection between nature and the human being, ranging from performances, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, when he placed his body in close contact with nature, particularly trees, stones, and water, but also sculpture, photography, prints, and drawings. The PMA exhibition, which stems from a donation of 309 drawings and 5 artist books, aims to present to the public part of this unique donation and focuses on drawings that range from 1966 until 2020. It also includes 10 groups of sculptures installed in the galleries and in Lenfest Hall, 2 projections, a 30 meters long frottage, and 1 monumental sculpture of a tree installed outside the west entrance called Identity. The grouping of works with different media and scales intends to display the plurality inherent to Penone's practice and the connection, both material and conceptual, between such different objects. As said, Penone grew up in the countryside in northern Italy. His work became known when it was shown in the late 1960s as part of the arte povera movement. Arte povera means poor art, impoverished art in English. A term coined by art critic and dealer Germano Cellant to describe a group of post-war Italian artists who rejected both the formal and ideological constraints of minimalism and ideas of US consumerism embodied in pop art. The movement was initially hailed by Cellant with the manifesto entitled Arte Povera, Notes for a Guerrilla Art, which, as the title said, had a clear political backdrop that went actually completely lost soon after. That was published in 1967 on the pages of Flash Art and went alongside 2 very important shows at the Galleria La Bertesca in Genoa in 1967 and at the Gallery dei Foscherari in Bologna in 1968. Penone, however, was the younger member of the group and joined them only in 1969 in the exhibition at the Galleria Civica in Turin. No doubt the acquaintance with other artists, mostly living in northern Italy, had a great impact on his work. When we met in Philadelphia, Penone actually told me that there were so few people at that time trying to push the boundaries of art that it was easy to find common intents and interest and become friends. It was natural. Yet I think he developed a very autonomous and unique poetics, and the show on view at the PMA very much reflects this autonomy in thinking and practice. So with the exhibition, we try to highlight certain features that pertain to Penone's entire practice, and therefore to all the media that compound this practice, and other more specific features that refer particularly to the drawings. So Steve, if you want to stop sharing, I'll share mine because I want to show the audience a few work specifically. So these are the installation. So among the features, the aspects of Penone work that we wanted to highlight, there is first the analogy in place between what is represented and the material used to represent it, both in drawings and sculptures. For example, the work that you see now on the screen is called Minds, 96, and belongs to an entire series that Penone dedicates to the mines, represent the dark interior of a tunnel in a mine, and is made of a graphite that is a natural material that comes from coal. In this way, it creates a two-for reference allusion to its subject via visual representation and also via the material component of the drawing itself. The second feature that is very important to understand the work of Giuseppe is the metamorphic quality of this work in terms of subject, forms, and constituents. Subject, because Penone is consciously influenced by classical art and literature, and here I always think of its metamorphoses. For example, he often uses laurel leaves, which in the collective imaginary are a clear reference to the myth of Apollo and Daphne. Forms, because as stressed in the title, they are never fixed, but they are like a river. They change across time and space. One form in Penone's work is always suggesting something out of the form itself. For example, in the series of breasts that I'm showing here, and I've been showing, the sculptures and this drawing now, this series is made of vases that are shaped like the artist has blown his breath into them, as you can see in the picture. At the same time, they have the form of a lungs. But the agency of air is not visible only in their shape, but also on an indexical level, as little waves on their edges that you can see very clearly in this picture. These waves allude to the vortexes of air and water present in some Leonardo's drawing of the beginning of the 16th century. And, there are another trait, another way that hair has an impact on this form and changes the form itself. The last metamorphic trait lies in the constituents, since Penone uses natural material, and these natural materials often change across time naturally. So understanding that fluidity of form for me is key to understand Penone practice. For what concerns drawing as a medium, we wanted to emphasize another variety of features. First, the heterogeneity of material. And probably through the slideshow, you have seen how many different material he employs in the drawings, from pencil, ballpoint pen, watercolor, coffee, like in this drawing, India ink, frottage, graphite, rice paper, cardboard, Japanese paper, glossy paper treated with turpentine, charcoal, adhesive tape, leaves, and skin imprints. The second very important feature is the fact that Penone subverts the traditional role of drawing, usually seen as ancillary to painting, sculpture, and architecture, and makes it the site of a technical and thematic experimentation. From this follows the categorization of three kinds of drawings disseminated across the exhibition that you will find. Sketches, like this one, that document, for example, the preparation of future installations or sculptures, or like in this case, it's an exhibition. This drawing is called Project for an Exhibition at Gianenzo Sperone's gallery in '69. There are other series of drawings. For example, this one that you see on the screen is called River Storm, Mountain Stone. that they built upon key concepts that are always expressed in another media. And that's why I showed you before these river stones. The two are very much interconnected. And the last kind of drawing is are more autonomous work like this one. So they don't have like a necessary relation to sculptures or to other media. And Penone thinks of them as really autonomous work, like this beautiful one that is made actually of the imprint of the nails and the fingerprint. And this led me to the last very important aspect that I want to highlight here is the use of the artist's skin in the form of touch as a subject matter tool. Touch is indeed one of the major themes, not only throughout the show, but also across Penone's entire oeuvre, since it functions as a conceptual and material interface between the self and nature. Indeed, I'd like to argue here and to conclude that the ubiquitous use of indexical sign like touch grants the artist of a closer and unmediated relationship with the surrounding world, and it opposes a minimal tendency that marks the history of drawing across the 60s and 70s that we see, for example, in artists like Sol LeWitt. The focus instead on an extreme reduction of the sign, a tendency that perhaps started already in the 50s with the seminal Erasing the Kooning drawing by Rauschenberg, which focused on deleting the touch of the artist, leaving almost invisible traces. Penone instead willingly leaves his marks on the paper, on the nature, and his gesture become the way we connect to nature, the interface between us and the natural world. Thank you. And Scott, I leave the floor to you.
Okay, let me try to share my screen. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Let's see the screen. Here we go. There. Okay, can you hear me? I'm going to be talking about
We can hear you, but not see your screen, Scott.
Can't see my screen.
No.
Okay.
There you go.
That better. Okay. I'm going to be talking about a revolution in biology, which relates very much to the art of Giuseppe Penone. And I want to bracket my talk with two quotations. One, the environment is part of the body by Lynn Margulis, an American biologist, and also the notion of, and if I can get this down here, that the cultural habits of humanity have always made room for the sacredness of nature, something that Simon Schama said in 1995. And let's see, this is, okay. So one of the major changes of biology between the 20th century and the 21st century has to do with the materials of construction. It has to do literally with what constitutes the fabric of nature. The notion of an individual organism has been totally changed in that we are anatomically, physiologically, and developmentally composed not of one organism, but of a consortium of interacting species. And most of these species are bacterial species. And so we have papers like The Symbiotic View of Life, We Have Never Been Individuals, or Animals in a Bacterial World, a new imperative for the life sciences. The word imperative is hardly ever used in a scientific communication, but here it is, a group of scientists saying we have to change the way we are looking at organisms, at animals and plants. We are not just one organism, we are hundreds of organisms. Each person is basically an ecosystem. So a new term has been coined by Lynn Margulis, the holobiont, the animal plus its persistent microbial communities. So when we think of a cow, we think of this female bovine organism eating grass, but the cow cannot digest grass. There's nothing in the genome of the cow that can encode enzymes capable of digesting cellulose. The ability to be a herbivore, the ability to digest plants is not the ability of the cow, it's the ability of the cow's symbionts, the bacteria that live in its gut, in its rumen. And it's these bacteria that eat the grass and metabolize the grass. Same thing with the termite. This termite, Mastotermes darwinensis, cannot digest wood, but it's a major pest. It's a major pest of homes. It eats wood, but the termite itself does not eat wood. Inside the termite guts is an organism, Mixotricha paradoxica, and this organism digests the wood. It has the enzymes capable of wood digestion, only it's not an organism. It's a composite of 5 different organisms together to make this one organism. So we have this notion of a holobiont. It's the organism plus its persistent microbial communities. Here we have coral, and the coral has in it, if it's alive, it has in it algae. The algae are responsible for taking the sunlight and using it for photosynthesis. And that photosynthesis makes over 90% of the sugars, the resources of the coral. So no animal exists independently. We are all not only organisms, but we are biomes. We are collections of ecosystem. Every pore in our body is an ecosystem. Over 50% of the human body cells are microbes, and they have specific locations. Each one of us has about 160 major species of microbes in us and on us, and they have different locations depending on which part of the body you look at. So we're not only an organism, we are a collection of ecosystems. Not only do animals exist as interdependent entities, we develop as interdependent agencies. This symbiosis between microbe and the larger biont is not due to mutually consenting adults. We are actually made by the microbes. The microbes, in addition to the human genome, make us human. So here we have intestinal vessels. This is of a mouse without microbes. The green here are the capillaries of the intestine. They're not very good. They're not very good at taking food out of the intestine. This is what happens when you have the microbes added back. The microbes make the intestinal capillaries. They are the ones that are in part responsible for inducing the genes of our gut cells to tell our gut cells, tell the cells around them to become capillaries. So microbes help form the normal gut by inducing gene expression in the mammalian cells. These microbes are expected parts of our developmental trajectory. We expect these microbes to be there. They help build us, and then they remain there and help us digest our foods. And this is the way nature works. The development of the orchid depends on the presence of a fungus to allow the seed to germinate. The development of our lymphoid system, the lymph tissues, depends on bacteria. This is heresy, to what I learned. I learned that the immune system exists to keep out bacteria. But no, before we have that immune system, the bacteria enter our bodies at birth, and they help form our immune system. So the notion of symbiosis, that we become with the other, has been something that Donna Haraway has been pointing to, that we actually become with the other. That symbiosis is evolution's co-author. This is a really important notion. And again, as Penone said, this is something this is a new version of what is the material of our existence. Our views of plants have totally changed. Plants we now see are holobionts, and they exist as interacting communities. They exist with other plants, they coexist with fungi, they exist with bacteria, and they exist with animals. The plant holobiont, it's hard to tell what is a plant and what is the environment. Plants interact with root fungi, and interact is too mild a word. They interpenetrate with fungi so that the fungi and the plant make a composite organism. These mycorrhizal fungi extend the root system. Here's the shoot over here. Here are the roots. The roots go out to get water and minerals, and the roots are extended by fungi. And this is critically important. They make the plant more efficient in extracting water, reduces the need for fertilizers, reduces the ability of plants to be stressed, improves the plant's yield. And so here we see a test crop growing in the University of Florida. This is corn, and this is with the mycorrhizal fungus over here. This is without the mycorrhizal fungus over there. And we see here control and inoculated, parallel things. So the mycorrhizal fungi extend the plant's roots, allowing the plant to absorb more water and waterborne nutrients, increasing the probability of plant survival. In 1997, Suzanne Simard showed that this ability of fungi to extend the plant roots creates what she called, and others, the wood wide web, that the mycorrhizal fungi connect plants, even plants of different species, into a cooperative network that we call the forest. And so, for instance, you see here one of her experiments where a spruce was able to give nutrients to a European beech plant. And one person, carbon assimilated by a 40-meter spruce was transferred to a neighboring beech, larch, and pine via the mycorrhizal fungi. In fact, up to 40% of the carbon in the fine roots of one tree had been photosynthesized by its neighbor, turning the notion of competition for resources being the prime interaction of evolution on its head. So we see that in addition to competition, there is enormous cooperation going on, and it's going on in some ways literally subterraneanly. It's going on beneath the surface. There's mycorrhizal fungi connecting plants and helping the plants to succeed. Simard also talked about mother trees, that small trees get their head starts from nutrients given to them by the mother trees through these mycorrhizal extensions of their roots. And when an older tree dies, it sends out its nutrients to younger trees, giving them a head start, saying, I've gotten all these nutrients over my years, here they are. And it gives most of them to closer trees, which tend to be relatives, offspring of their own. So these plants are not really individuals in the sense that Darwin thought they were individuals competing for survival of the fittest. In fact, they're trying to help each other to survive. Okay. Simard's books and interviews emphasize that indigenous science knew these relationships. As she said in one interview, it is science, closely observed science, way more mature. We're not even close. The current scientific method is a narrow way of seeing things. Mistreatment of one species is mistreatment of all. The rest of the planet has been waiting patiently for us, that's Western science, to figure that out. And she mentions, for instance, that the three sisters of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Cherokee cultivation, the corn, squash, and beans, are literally linked by mycorrhizal fungi. Again, getting back to the plant holobiont, those beans are important. Legumes, such as beans, interact with bacteria to make the nitrogen in the air usable. Nitrogen in the air, N2, is not a usable element. The interactions between the roots and the bacteria, not the fungi now, but the bacteria and the roots. Those make nitrogen into ammonia and nitric oxide, which can be used to make proteins and nucleic acid. And they will not only do it for themselves, but through the fungi will feed the non-legume crops. So we have a system here where the symbiosis being done in the bean is being given to the other plants that are nearby. Symbiosis and humans and plants. Okay, this is a question that's almost always given in intro bio tests. Which of the following contributes the most to a tree's biomass? You see this tree with the huge trunk. What contributes most to that biomass? Is it water, soil nutrients, air, sunlight, and water and soil? The answer is C, the air. The air is what gives the carbon to the tree, what is called carbon sequestration. Carbon dioxide being breathed out by animals is taken into the plant, and it's made into carbon resources, which allows the material of the plant to exist. And the plant, through photosynthesis, gives out oxygen. It's air, it's breath that causes the plant to have its biomass. And I think Penone kind of made an icon of this in this study for the breath of bronze. Here is a tree literally coming out of breath. The tree might be important for us in other ways as well. And here we see just walking in a forest may actually help our health. How nature nurtures. The amygdala activity of the brain decreases for a 1 hour walk in nature. And this over here, you see the fear conditioning of the amygdala going down from before the walk and after the walk. Walking in an urban setting does not do that. In the immune system, the making of what are called natural killer cells, lymphocytes that destroy cancers and foreign cells, those are made more by walking in the forest. And also the cortisol levels, the stress hormone levels, also go down by just taking a walk in a forest. So there's now research that's starting to show that the forests is interacting with the human being. So trees as cultural enterprises, as I mentioned before, Simon Schama documented that forests and rivers are cultural enterprises. The forest symbolizes many different things in different nationalities. So what is the forest for our time? In some cases, it's an elder or an exemplar. We can learn things from the forest, such as symbiosis and cooperation. It's also seen as a survivor, a remnant, a refugium, a remnant of a vast network of life. In some cases, the forest is seen as a savior. We had been planting trees solely for natural resources. Now they say plant forests in order to save humanity. Just want to leave with some comments. One in a recent book edited by Carolyn Jones. Symbiosis was born in biology. Contemporary artists are in tune with this reality, exploring networks of relationships with the more than human companions found throughout the ecosystems we share and are. And Sarah Gilbert and I, writing and afterwards for a book which should come out shortly, historical evidence suggests a complex symbiosis between biology and art, such that changes in one affect changes in the other. Revolutions in biology often require new approaches to representation, as biology changes from a science of items to a science of processes, as natural history and human history fuse in the Anthropocene, and as organisms are discovered to be ecosystems, as well as individuals, novel approaches to art science are required. Such projects involve a reframing of experimental staging and collaborations amongst organisms and materials that is not only descriptive of the worlds we can perceive, but also generative of reconfigured potential alternatives. So thank you very much. Okay.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I just wanted to say, I'm called from my namesake, Navayuk. My family is from Uwiwak, King Island, and Querak, Mary's Igloo, Alaska. And I want to walk quickly through a few slides. We have some time constraints today, and I want to be mindful of that for those of us who were planning on an hour. Let's see. I'm going to presume here that many in the audience have the resources or interest to familiarize themselves with some of the basic terms that I'm going to step through rather quickly today, and thinking about this particularly in terms of the intersectionality of the topics that we're to discuss. And so here are some notes on Penone's poetic entanglements and the Anthropocene, as dominant culture has preferred to call this time that we are in. Here are some thoughts on indigeneity, returning index, iconic sign, and function. I'd like to foreground a few of the poems that I will read today that are in conversation with the exhibition right now, with some of the scholarship by one of, I think, the foremost thinkers, scholars, intellects that we as Indigenous people have today, Dr. Jen Rose Smith, who is IAC. And here are a few quotes of Dr. Smith's, which are, a turn towards poetry is a form of evidence upends an over-reliance on science as arbiter. Excuse me, I'm having trouble with my screen, excuse me for that. Let me hide that and I'll share my screen again. Sorry, technical problems. A turn toward poetry is a form of evidence, upends an over-reliance on science as an arbiter of truth, both in a climate crisis and toward a conclusion of human origins. And from Matt Hooley, who is not Indigenous, but Indigenous adjacent in his scholarship, the end of is a structure of political affect, a framework for thinking about how we are connected and disconnected amid changing conditions of harm and relief, which I bring to bear in the context of both the conversations of the other panelists today, and also in terms of Penone's work, and some of the thinking that I think undergirds many of his most experimental turns in the 60s and 70s. Back to Smith, along with Klaus Dodds. We further assert for a ground to articulate an Arctic that does not lose the verifiable danger and precarity of ice melt and the livelihoods that continue to be changed, transformed, and dispossessed, which is largely consequential from the enactments of racial capitalism, but that also holds the refusal to fall victim to an alarmist, polemical, devastation, and declensionist narrative. The declensionist narrative is one that has been historical and often wielded to discuss the Indigenous peoples and their inevitable disappearance conveniently from resource-rich areas. Is there a way to identify the enactments of colonialism without a spectacularized event of damage, loss, and the horror of that loss as a vessel of discussion? Is it possible to have that conversation without lionizing Indigenous resilience as a life lesson for non-Indigenous peoples elsewhere? Going forward, a task for ICE humanities scholars is to be ever mindful of becoming inhumanities in the sense of erasing/dispossessing those who inhabit worlds where there are co-relationalities with ICE, multi-species relationships, and multiple spatialities, seasonalities, and temporalities that do not pivot around Euro-American global framings of time and space, geopolitical worlding, and extractive capitalism. And I will leave with this last quote from Herbert Anungazak, who is also in fact from Wales, Alaska. And I will read just a few poems in the interest of the abbreviated time that we have today. This is a poem called Dark Traffic. It appears in a book by the same name. Dark Traffic. And the snows buffer the sound of a voice set forth. I thought her lost already, that she had gone to neglect the late migration. Before it ceases, the ice collapses easily. There is no day without a symptom. Consolation may turn out to be a guttural practice. After all, the small gesture of sound lodged deep before it glides without warning downward. There is nothing but the wind, a howl and dive where water is thrown over water and sewn into it. A howl and dive of wind, water over water, She found water, she found flown over water where once we found ice, where the snow once stuttered the sound of that shouting for this listener, holding her head in her hands, the head in its fine, blank way, and original. And another poem from the same book, it's called Rookeries, and I was thinking of the river of forms here and choosing this poem to share with you today. Rookeries. All men knew a secret of the northern part of an old world, a less perfect idea. For the bicornuate woman, it was an island. Though its birds lose our trust, we might learn their language. After all, we have been taught to read and write, to remove our hands from other work as we watch water twist into rock, to cover our wounds, staying alive light after light. For something, I worry. The moon pronounced with clarity its known topography. Our letters and lists reconstructed grammars. They replace the ways in which we were grabbed and pushed, then shoved. Set a wife and her children to rove with indefinite orders. Lineal migration on a small scale is not nautical, but conflictual. Of those men, we knew I could never do them any good. In this way, I forget and let the wind river. It gales and tears at my shoulders and wrists. Finally, I will read one last poem and then eager to hear from Sarah today. This is a poem called The Incident Light. In it, you will hear the names of four women, four Inupiatan names. One is that of my namesake, Navayuk. The others are the three other women who brought me to King Island, Uwivak, in 2014. The Incident Light. I went for relief of the mind, to move into currents of worry. I did not know what the body held. I thought I would turn through broken ice and disappear the features of apprehension, of influence. If only I could betray the brute matter. If only the seas had not erased the fracture ladder, the easy reach. Instead, we sank into soft snow, for women ascending together the deep furrow worn by water, returning to water. Ayahodok, Oyugolok, Yayuk, Navayuk. I was startled at once aware that the far road had fractured, done under by the fault we fought to bury. Land arises beyond the trouble of strong currents. The boat that bears us rises in them. With invisible stars, we share blood. Those seas increased might scour and reflect. Those seas increased rephrase us. And again, before I leave with the words of Herbert Anungazak, I want to just mention a few of the beautiful thoughts that are in the exhibit catalog, and thinking about poetry in the context of this conversation. If Basualo's assertion from the catalog, which is without doubt, a mimetic sculptural representation brings a double into being. If that holds true, I'm thinking about populating this conversation and the conversation with Penone's work with doubles of all kinds. And then another from Dr. Demori, which I will save for later. But thank you so much for spending time with me and my poems today. And we'll turn it over now to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Joan. I have like goosebumps from hearing some of that poetry. It was really stunning. Let me just get my comportment back a little bit. And thank you, Stephen, for sharing my slides. So we're going to try to coordinate with my notes and Stephen progressing the images, and apologies in advance for any difficulties that might entail. So just a little context to situate myself. I'm an artist and a craftsperson and an educator, and I guess I'm coming to this panel thinking what I can bring specifically and really thinking about what it means to have a material practice and what kind of insights we can think about in terms of a material practice and what our responsibility as viewers might be in encountering the Penone show. And I wanted to start with this image, this drawing in the exhibition called The Vegetal Gaze, which I thought was really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because I think gaze, I think there's a really strong tension in the so-called Western tradition between seeing and feeling, kind of vision and touching, right? We tend to think of those as binaries, just like we tend to think of the mind-body binary. And of course, no binaries are neutral in this kind of traditional hierarchical tradition that we're thinking of philosophically. So that mind is always sort of prioritized over body, just as the male is prioritized over the female, and the transcendental thought over bodily stuff. And so to me, this drawing really struck me as kind of complicating a lot of those ideas right away, and that you have, I guess you can view it on the one hand as kind of a head, and the gaze implies kind of, that cone of vision coming out from the eyes and towards the world, right? So it starts with the human eye pupil and it extends out into the world. But I think what this drawing so lovely articulates is that it just as much, if not more so, comes back the other way, right? That it's these kind of like roots that coalesce at certain junctures, right? That our vision is shaped by everything around us. And that all of these little neurons that our receptors are picking up on, they're very haptic, they're very touch, like vision is actually based on touch. It's not just seeing. You can't disconnect the two. Those binaries really don't hold. And so I love to think about this drawing in the context of Penone's work and in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, which is like material practice and haptic perception. So thinking about material practice in the sense of a craft, or what we might call making, but I prefer the term practice because I prefer to think of it like, I think making implies an object as outcome, and I think practice implies more of a process and an ongoingness. And then how that relates to kind of thinking of vision as tactile. And I think the drawings in Penone's work as this kind of interface between the image and the object, and a kind of really intentional blurring of those, something that won't allow us to have those binaries, is something that's always been really influential for me in my own work when I think about Penone. And I remember encountering his work for the first time as an undergraduate and just being kind of blown away by it. And so maybe in thinking, along with what Joan was just talking about, these kind of other ways besides this kind of Western dichotomous tradition, what are other ways of kind of thinking, feeling with our environment? And thinking back to my dad, Scott Gilbert's presentation too, about the holobiont and what it means to be like not just in the environment, but actually co-constructing with your environment, right? That you're always a kind of composite. And I was thinking about Alan Watts, and he had this great quote that I love where he says, the Western scientist may rationally perceive the idea of organism environment as like a collective combined thing, but he does not ordinarily feel this to be true. By cultural and social conditioning, he has been hypnotized into experiencing himself as an ego, as an isolated center of consciousness and will inside a bag of skin, confronting an external and alien world. We say, I came into this world, but we did nothing of the kind. We came out of it in just the way that the fruit comes out of trees. So go ahead, next slide. So I want to talk about craft as a verb, what it means to craft something. And I prefer that to making because I don't like the outcome objectness of making, and also the individualness of making. People talk about like, I am a maker as an identity. And what I really want to think about is craft as a material practice that is necessarily always collective. It's always a coming together, even if you think of kind of the most stereotypical example of the singular artist in the studio alone, supposedly alone. They're never alone. It's always a coming together of materials and tools, and the history of those materials is alive, right? So in the case of working on a woodworker, right, you are working with this entire history of a being, of a tree that used to be alive, that probably many aspects within the wood are still alive. There are probably fungal communities still living in there, right? The tools that you're using have their own material histories. So craft is always sort of an encounter of the human, the more than human, multi-speciesness, and also the non-human of these kind of mediating technologies and tools, right? So the first thing I want to think of with craft is as this communal coming together. The second thing I want to think of it is like to craft, I think, implies a kind of curiosity. This encounter where you're crafting something implies that you are curious about it, that you are meeting it, that you are coming together with something a little bit unknown that you want to learn more about, right? And the third part of it is that requires care. It requires attuning to your surroundings, understanding what you know and don't know. It implies really like experiencing things in both valences of that term, both like experiencing things as they happen, but also accruing experience over time, right? And so I want to think, if we think of craft as a practice, I want to think of craft, again, not just as like a maker or an individual who imposes form onto matter, but to think of it as a way of, that we might even think of vision, or how we as viewers enter an exhibition as crafting an experience. Like, yes, the artist has provided all these objects and they are sort of there and displayed and the curator has arranged them, but there's also this new encounter that happens when you enter a space, when you enter a museum, when you enter a kind of space where you're bringing all of your history and you're sort of crafting that experience as you go. And so I want to, in this talk about some of the kind of obstacles to that, like why, as Alan Watts says, is it so much easier to kind of understand intellectually that we are not like subject separate from environment, but this kind of intermix of constantly changing factors? Why is it so much easier for us to understand that intellectually than it is for us to feel it? And I want to think about navigating exhibitions and the experience of art as something that we actually craft to as viewers, as much as the artist is shaping them too. So to kind of think about some of these histories is to really think about also some hierarchies, right? Like craft is usually considered below art. It's like considered less about willful individual action and novel production. It's considered for that reason less human, right? Like individual action and novel production are considered what makes us above the animal, separate, willful. And I want to think about how craft then can actually be a way to help us think in more enmeshed multi-species ways. So we have this kind of hierarchy of, in the so-called West, of kind of like painting at the very top, and you can get more nuanced within that with like history painting and portraiture and, you know, et cetera, but sculpture was very much considered lowly. And I think the reasons for this are actually really, really interesting and worth exploring in the context of Penone's work and thinking about how drawing intersects with it. And this had to do with sculpture being seen, you can go ahead, next slide, Stephen. Sculpture being seen as a mechanical art instead of a liberal art. And this goes all the way back to Hegel, who said that the sculpted figure, you know, not merely lacks what is properly the color of painting, but also the glance of the eyes. It goes back to Leonardo da Vinci, who said that the sculptor in producing his work makes a manual effort in striking the marble to remove what is superfluous. And this is a wholly mechanical exercise, right? That the sculpture is already there. You just have to, like a plumber, kind of figure it out. And then it goes back often to the eyes and this kind of obstinacy of material, which I want to get to, that materials kind of push back at you. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty said that he called it the gaze without pupils, the unreflecting mirror of things, that when you look at a sculpture, unlike a painting, its eyes never meet yours. It never stares back. Next slide. And you have famously in the more modern era, writers like Charles Baudelaire, who wrote a very famous essay called The Painters of Modern Life. But another one of his less known essays, which I think is an interesting companion essay, is called Why Sculpture is a Bore. And the idea was that sculpture or physical materials, instead of a transcendent window into another world, the kind of physical stuff was too thingly. It was too much like dolls or too obstinate. It couldn't transcend you into another world, is really the point. Next slide. And you have kind of humorous takes on this too. So a cartoon of Sculpture's dismay at being surrounded by painting, right? Like this kind of protesting figure, just being angry that nobody is paying attention to her. But within this, you have a lot of kind of lurking dualisms that I think come to bear when we're trying to think of symbiosis science, or we're trying to think of becoming with, or we're trying to think about more than human worlds and agencies. Go ahead, next slide. For instance, these dualisms that can start with the ideal and the real, right? A painting is like an ideal world somewhere else. Sculpture is kind of the real and the tactile. Opticality, tactility, subject, object, male, female, thinking and feeling, which is the one I really want to focus on today, right? That these are not only separate, but one is typically privileged, right? Like the thinking is typically privileged over feeling. And what would it mean actually to think about prioritizing feeling, and how does Penone's work kind of allow us to prioritize feeling, or force us even to prioritize feeling rather than thinking, which I think is really interesting. And to that point, I think it gets really interesting to think about the things that are denigrated in craft, in material practices, right? We tend to think that as a verb describing human activity, craft tends to evoke collective and repetitive labor oriented towards a predetermined end. No matter how inspired someone is, like in the moment, it's not like a genius inspired, all of a sudden off the cuff thing, like it can be in certain forms of modern art, right? Craft is thought of as you can't just do it on the fly. Hand skills have to be learned through repeated practice over time until they become internalized as muscle memory or second nature. Orders of operations are imperative. And typically practitioners share the same techniques, and these develop not only over the lifetime of one maker or one practitioner, but also across the wider practice and deeper histories. So it's always a collective practice in that sense too. And so what I want to think about today is, what if instead of assuming that the collective and repetitive aspects of crafts are shortcomings that have to be kind of surmounted, what if we instead explore them as a really fecund practice for the cultivation of what we might call, in line with philosopher Gilles Deleuze, like the apprenticeship of the unconscious, a kind of heightened corporeal attunement that opens us to material potential precisely by resisting a kind of ego or a authorial I think or I act subject position. Next slide. So this all kind of goes back to Kant, and this kind of idea of individual human action, where he says, by right, it is only through an act of will that places reason as the basis of action that should be called art. For although we are pleased to call what bees produce, their regularly produced cells, a work of art, we do so only on the strength of analogy. That is to say, as soon as we call to mind no deliberation forms the basis of their labor, we say at once it is a product of their nature. Or instinct. So again, like everything that is made in the vegetal and animal world cannot be called art according to this, because it is unthinking, it is not willful, right? Which is obviously just completely absurd and really damaging, and it destroys kind of our ability to think collectively. So and it immediately also divides the world into kind of functional things and things for themselves, or autonomous art, right? But what if this if this kind of dialectic of function and autonomy that only concerns human culture, and it says nature is only relevant as a foil against which humans can define our distinctly free creativity, what kinds of craft thinking might emerge if we kind of refuse this nature culture binary from the start? What about the assumption that craft must be the labor of individual human subjects who by conscious reasoning and willful action transform inert material into distinctly ingenious products of culture? Or the assumption that this inert material is extracted from a necessarily unconscious nature composed of vegetables, animals, and minerals capable only of instinctual or deterministic behavior, right? And again, I think this touches on what both of the other speakers just talked about, so I'll try to wrap up quickly. But this sense that we have that we're so sure that, you know, the materials are dead, the world is dead, it's only humans that can produce these ingenious things is absurd. And I think Penone's work is so strong in that it forces us to kind of confront the absurdity of that. Go ahead, next slide. I'll kind of skip through some of these really quick. So thinking about in line with the holobiont or indigenous thinking in terms of systems and collectivity, like what if instead of thinking about fixed identity, me, Sarah, encountering you, somebody else in the world, or encountering environment as separate from me, what if instead of that we think of ourselves as clusters of differences that we identify as Sarah for a moment, but that always have to change, right? They're always in flux and they're always influenced by the other things we come in contact with. And that, you know, everything from my metabolism to what I eat to who I come in contact with is shifting who I am on a daily basis. Next slide. Next slide. I'll just skip through some of these because we're running quickly out of time. And thinking about Penone's work just in terms of this, like the obstinacy of materials. Again, what I love about this work, so this is a work where he had, you know, a bronze cast of his hand around a sapling tree, and over time the sapling grew around the bronze cast, right? And it's less about the bronze trying to be a stand-in for a real human fleshy hand, which would also degrade over time, right? And it's more about this kind of like material obstinacy, like that the plant matter continues to grow, that the bronze cast is so much in this world. It is not a window into another place, right? Go ahead, next slide. And I think that allows us to think of these materials not as inert and dead, but as having their own agency and their own life at least as much as the artist, and I hope as much as the viewer too, that the viewer is not this kind of passive consumer of an exhibition, but rather a really kind of active co-constructor in the act of the experience of the art. Yeah, go ahead, next slide. So returning to how we open, like how can we better feel what we know, I think has to do a lot with like, how do we really collectively craft experience? How do we sort of enter situations with an open comportment, acknowledging that, nothing is just deriving from us, that center and those conical eyes, but is always being kind of collectively shaped and made. And how can we kind of allow that to affect our experience of works of art and really think of it as an encounter rather than like a fixed object that's already done and we don't really have any responsibility other than to passively consume. Yeah, I'll stop there because we're out of time.
Thank you, Sarah. And I invite all the panelists to turn their camera on. I know we are a little bit over time, so I'm just going to make very quick reflection about all your beautiful talks And if you want to ask then questions to yourself, to each other, that would be great. But thanks so much. It was so fascinating for me to see the work of Giuseppe that I worked on for so many years through different perspectives. Each one of your talk made me think of one of the aspects I was trying to highlight in my introduction. So for you, Scott, of course, I think that the key word was a little bit like the symbiotic. So the symbiotic relation between humans and other organisms, that was I was trying to say that, that Giuseppe works a lot on, the interconnectedness between organism and between us and himself and the nature. And kind of art for him is like the interface, but also the way that allows us to have like this closer connection. And I really like the fact that you said that there's more cooperation between organisms than competition. And also that, there is sort of a cooperation on different levels. So we use trees, we plant trees because they help us, but then the trees, they help themselves. So there are several levels of cooperation, which I found that so fascinating in the way that the environment is constructed. And I think this is very much reflected in Penone's work. You, Jane, when you were speaking, your words were so beautiful. It almost made me visualize the work of Giuseppe. The word I was thinking of is the metamorphic that I had already mentioned, because you were, talking about correlations, but also changing, like ecological changes in lands, in movements, historical change, and historical shift, domestic shift, which are all important traits. And there is a sentence that really made me think to one of the work of Giuseppe that is, about how water has an impact on nature, which is this sentence, I hope I'm quoting it correctly, as we watched water twist into rocks. So it really, if you think about the two rocks that are shown at some point, one, Penone picked it up because it was molded by, the river. It's a natural store that comes from a riverbed. And the other one, he's molded by himself as an apparent trying to make an exact copy of that natural stone. So it's a sort of like parallelism between like nature intervening on nature, let's say, and man intervening on nature, but not in the sense of overcoming nature, but in the sense of how the two things become once in a way and change across time and space. And Sarah, you made me think of touch that I touched upon. Craft is a lot about touch. You showed that picture with a section of a tree with the hands on. And that reminded me a lot of Penone's work, especially, trees is a constant in his practice. He thinks about trees grow, trees aging, and, especially like the sections. And I really also like the fact that you stressed vision, the haptic vision, and thanks for bringing haptic into the discussion, and dualism. So I think dualism is so important because our society, Western society, is very much focused on dualism. And actually I see in Penone's work an attempt to overcome such dualism. So for him, there's no more a dualism in between nature and culture. Linnea, do we have time for maybe pick some questions from the chat?
Sure, I think so. And we actually have a few questions.
We have a few questions.
Chat.
So does the notion of mirror occur in Penone's work? Yes, very much so. I haven't talked about this work, but there is a sort of like performance he sort of did when he was in early 20s. And in the PMA exhibition, there is a work on view in which you can see Penone. It's a series of projected slides that you see Penone when he was young on an empty road, like in the middle of nowhere, wearing mirroring contact lenses. So basically, he cannot see because he's made blind by these mirroring contact lenses. But these contact lenses, of course, reflect us. Not only reflect us, but reflect the natural world around it. So mirrors comes into place in these issues of, viewing and be viewed in the domain of perception that Sarah also was touching upon. And this presentation, okay, this is, I think it's for Scott. I read it out loud. These presentations raise a new meaning for edges, such as permeability between tree and fungi, textures that don't just hold in or keep out. Is this another part of the dualities listed here? Who wants to respond? Is a little bit for everyone, because I think we all touched upon these things in different ways. New meaning for hedges and permeability between trees and fungi, textures, dualities. It's another part of dualities listed here.
Yeah, I can mention some things about edges, which are just becoming fascinating right now. And that's, we often talk about interactions, whereas people like Levins and Lewontin actually want to talk about interpenetrations, that it's the edges are really very porous, such that when I talk about the fungi, in many cases, the fungi are not just add-ons to the plant, they are actually getting into the cortex of the roots. They are interpenetrating the plant is interpenetrating them, and then they go outward. The fungi, the bacteria, not only interact with the legume roots, they interpenetrate the legume roots. And we see this so much, and I'm sorry that Dr. Kosha isn't here, Emmanuel Kosha isn't here, because he talks about in living things, the container is always part of the contained. And I think that that is such a crucial issue in biology right now. Living things that are containers are not inert and separate from that which they contain. You think about the uterus, it's interacting with the embryo totally, physiologically, immunologically, anatomically. The notion of containment is really something that living systems kind of laughs at a bit. Containment is never really a true container. It always is an interactor or an interpenetrator.
I'll add quickly that I'm thinking about material, language as material, and also thinking about across cultures globally, language as a living archive. Yes, for human consciousness, for knowledge, for technology. So yes, I mean, I think in some ways I'd be very interested to see the exhibit, the show, and sort of interrogate that as well.
I just wanted to add into from a very different direction. I guess there are ways of thinking about edges and boundaries spatially, but I think it's also interesting to think from a materials perspective about them, like kind of more temporally in terms of I'm sure Scott could offer some better examples within biology. I'm just thinking of edge states, or like up until 33 degrees, water is water. And then all of a sudden at 32 degrees, it becomes ice, right? So our perception of change, I think, is really interesting in terms of edges and boundaries as it relates to temporality and environmental interactions or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all these contributions. Linnea, I'm looking at you because I don't know if I can read more questions, or we have to stop here.
I regret, I think we're only scratching the surface, but we are running a bit over, and in the interest of everyone's time, we should probably find a close. But thank you all. And if you do have any last things you wanted to perhaps say in relation to your presentations and to Penone, to the other speakers, I think now is the moment. Okay, well, wonderful. I will just say thank you all so much. We've gotten some lovely comments in the chat, but also thank you all for such a rich set of presentations. What I hope for all of us is that they give us different sets of lenses we could bring to Penone's work. I encourage you all to come and do that for yourselves in our galleries. A huge thank you to all of you. A thank you to Lara and to Carlos Basualdo for our early discussions conceptualizing the panel. A thank you to our speakers, Joan, Scott, Sarah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Linnea, for organizing, and to all these amazing speakers, Scott, Sarah, and Joan. And I see someone in the chat saying that they want part 2, so who knows?
Part 2 to come. Yeah. And of course, thank you to the family of Raza and Perry. This annual endowed lecture enables us to offer this program freely. Thanks to Steve Keever and Greg Stewart, as always, for making everything work behind the scenes today, and also to our live captioner, Sky, thank you. And for all of you who have stuck with us on our slightly long but very rich program, we're so delighted to have you here. I hope you are piqued to revisit the work of Penone and reconsider your own relationship to nature. Just by being here, you are supporting the museum, and we are grateful to have you with us. Extra thanks to our members and those who donated in support of today's program. You allow us to continue to offer programs like this. And in terms of upcoming programs, our next virtual talk will be on Matisse Model in Studio. It's next Thursday, November 17th at noon. We'll put a link to register in the chat. We'll also send a follow-up email. It'll have a link to this recording. It'll have the link to our upcoming program, so you could look there if you want to sign up. And that is that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.